The lanterns still swayed in the mountain wind, their flames dancing against October darkness like fireflies trapped in glass. Inside the ornate medicine wagon, bottles of cure-all tonics caught the flickering light. But the man who'd promised miracles to desperate Appalachian families had vanished without a trace. This disappearance would haunt Creswell County for over a century, spawning legends that still echo through these ancient hills. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood had rolled into the settlement of Millhaven on October 15, 1902, his wagon wheels crunching over frost-brittle leaves, while steam rose from his horse's nostrils in the crisp mountain air. The scent of wood smoke and dying autumn mingled with something else, a sharp, medicinal tang that seemed to follow his elaborate caravan like an invisible cloud. Local children pressed their faces against cabin windows, watching this spectacle of painted wood and brass fittings navigate the rutted dirt road that served as Millhaven's main thoroughfare. Blackwood cut an impressive figure perched atop his driver's seat. Tall and lean with a carefully waxed mustache, he wore a black coat adorned with silver buttons that caught the afternoon sun. His voice, when he began his pitch, carried the practiced rhythm of a man who delivered the same promises in 100 different towns. "Ladies and gentlemen of this fine mountain community," he called out, tipping his silk hat to the gathering crowd, "I bring you liberation from suffering, deliverance from ailment, freedom from the cruel bondage of pain and sickness that has plagued humanity since time immemorial." The timing of his arrival seemed almost providential. Millhaven had endured a particularly harsh year. The spring floods had destroyed half the crops, leaving families struggling to prepare for winter. Worse, a mysterious wasting sickness had claimed 3 children and left dozens of adults bedridden with symptoms the local doctor couldn't explain. Persistent fever, violent coughing, and a peculiar discoloration of the fingernails that resembled tarnished silver. From the Journal of Sarah Mackenzie, October 16, 1902. The medicine man speaks with such authority about cures. Mama's been poorly since July, and Dr. Morrison says there's nothing more he can do. Perhaps this stranger offers hope where our own physician offers only sympathy. Blackwood's wagon was a marvel of craftsmanship and showmanship, painted deep emerald with gold lettering that proclaimed Dr. Blackwood's Miraculous Remedies and Botanical Tonics. It featured fold-out panels that revealed shelves lined with hundreds of bottles, each containing liquids of different colors: ruby red, amber gold, deep purple, and an unsettling shade of green that seemed to shift in the lamplight. But the bottles weren't the wagon's most striking feature. That distinction belonged to the collection of testimonial letters and photographs that Blackwood had mounted on easels around his temporary stage. Images of people before and after his treatments, their faces transformed from gaunt desperation to radiant health. Letters of gratitude from mayors, ministers, and prominent citizens across the region, all praising the doctor's miraculous interventions. "Behold the power of scientific advancement combined with nature's own pharmacy," Blackwood declared, gesturing toward his display. "These individuals suffered as you suffer, despaired as you despair, until they discovered the healing properties contained within these humble vessels." The demonstration that followed would be remembered by witnesses for the rest of their lives. Blackwood called forward Martha Stevens, a local woman whose arthritis had left her nearly unable to walk. Before the assembled crowd, he administered 3 drops of a silver-colored tonic beneath her tongue. Within minutes, Stevens was not only walking, but dancing, her face radiant with relief and wonder. The crowd erupted in amazement and desperate hope. Orders poured in as family after family stepped forward with their coins and their pain, purchasing bottles of Blackwood's various remedies. The doctor accepted payment with solemn dignity, explaining the proper dosages and offering personal consultations for the most severe cases. What none of them noticed was how carefully Blackwood studied each customer's face, or how his fingers lingered when collecting payment, as if memorizing the texture of their desperation. By evening, he'd sold nearly every bottle in his inventory and scheduled private appointments for the following 3 days. The grateful townspeople invited him to stay at the boarding house, but Blackwood politely declined, explaining that his medicines required specific storage conditions best maintained in his specialized wagon. He made camp in Deadman's Hollow, a secluded clearing 2 miles outside town where local folklore claimed Confederate deserters had once hidden from Union patrols. The location seemed fitting for a man trafficking in mysteries, surrounded by ancient oaks whose gnarled branches formed a natural cathedral of shadows and whispered secrets. That night, several residents reported seeing strange lights flickering in the hollow. Not the warm yellow glow of campfires, but an eerie blue-white illumination that pulsed with mechanical regularity. What were those lights really signaling in the darkness of Dead Man's Hollow? 3 days later, when the first customers arrived for their scheduled appointments, they would discover something that would transform Millhaven's miracle into its greatest nightmare. Thomas Mackenzie's boots struck the frozen ground with the sound of splintering wood as he approached the clearing, where flickering shadows danced against canvas walls. The metallic scent of copper pennies hung heavy in the morning air, while frost-covered grass crunched beneath his feet like broken bones. The discovery waiting in Deadman's Hollow would shatter any hope that Blackwood's disappearance was merely an inconvenience. Mackenzie had arrived at precisely 9 o'clock on October 18th, clutching the appointment card Blackwood had written in his flowing script 3 days earlier. His wife Sarah's condition had worsened overnight. The mysterious wasting sickness now claimed her appetite entirely, and her fingernails had taken on that same tarnished silver hue that marked the disease's progression through Millhaven. The wagon stood exactly where Blackwood had positioned it, but something fundamental had changed. The ornate panels hung open like broken wings, revealing shelves that should have contained hundreds of colorful bottles. Instead, empty wooden slots gaped like missing teeth, creating geometric patterns of absence against the wagon's dark interior. The brass fittings that had gleamed so brilliantly in the afternoon sun now appeared tarnished, as if years rather than days had passed since Blackwood's arrival. More disturbing was the evidence of hasty departure scattered around the campsite. Personal belongings lay strewn across the clearing, a leather-bound ledger with pages torn and scattered, a silver pocket watch stopped at 3:47, and articles of clothing that bore dark stains Mackenzie preferred not to examine too closely. The horses were gone, but their hobbles remained, cut through with something sharp enough to slice leather like paper. From the Millhaven Township records, October 18, 1902. Citizen report filed by T. Mackenzie regarding abandoned property in Deadman's Hollow. Wagon intact, but occupant missing. Sheriff Morrison dispatched for investigation. Mackenzie circled the wagon cautiously, calling Blackwood's name into the forest silence. No response came except the echo of his own voice bouncing off ancient tree trunks and the distant caw of carrion birds, whose presence seemed ominous rather than coincidental. Inside the wagon, the scene grew more puzzling. Blackwood's living quarters occupied the rear section behind his medicine display, and here Mackenzie found signs of a struggle, or perhaps something worse. The narrow bed had been stripped of its covers, revealing a mattress stained with substances that defied easy identification. Dark splotches covered the wooden floor in patterns that suggested either spilled medicine or something far more sinister. But the most unsettling discovery awaited in Blackwood's makeshift laboratory. A compact workspace tucked behind a false wall contained equipment that seemed far more sophisticated than anything a traveling medicine show would require. Glass apparatus of unusual design connected by rubber tubing, measurement devices calibrated to fractions Mackenzie couldn't understand, and most disturbing of all, a collection of specimen jars containing what appeared to be organic matter preserved in clear fluid. Each jar bore a label written in Blackwood's distinctive handwriting, but the contents defied identification by any honest physician. The medicine had been a lie. Mackenzie stumbled backward from the wagon, his mind struggling to process what he'd discovered. The testimonial letters and photographs that had seemed so convincing now took on a sinister aspect. What if they hadn't documented healing, but something else entirely? What if Blackwood's treatments had purposes that bore no relation to medical care? As he prepared to leave and summon the sheriff, Mackenzie noticed something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Fresh wagon tracks led away from the clearing, but they headed deeper into the mountains rather than toward any established road. The impressions in the soft earth were deep and uneven, as if the wagon had been heavily loaded when it departed. More troubling still, the tracks were accompanied by footprints, not the neat boot prints of a man walking beside his wagon, but the desperate, stumbling impressions of multiple people being forced forward against their will. Sheriff Morrison arrived within the hour, accompanied by Deputy Walsh and Dr. Patterson, the county's only other physician besides the local practitioner who'd proven helpless against the wasting sickness. Their investigation would uncover evidence that transformed Blackwood from missing person to prime suspect in something far worse than medical fraud. The torn pages from Blackwood's ledger, when reassembled, revealed not patient records, but detailed observations of physical and behavioral symptoms. The entries read less like medical notes and more like a naturalist's field journal documenting the progress of some controlled experiment. Subject exhibits expected deterioration of motor function, read one fragment dated October 16th. Discoloration proceeding as anticipated. Recommend increased dosage for optimal harvesting conditions. Harvesting conditions. Dr. Patterson's examination of the wagon's laboratory equipment revealed traces of substances that had no legitimate medical applications, compounds that could induce the very symptoms Millhaven's residents had been experiencing, while others seemed designed to preserve or extract something from living tissue. The realization struck the investigators with horrifying clarity. Blackwood hadn't come to Millhaven to cure the wasting sickness. He had come to cause it. The question that haunted Sheriff Morrison as he studied those wagon tracks leading into the wilderness was whether Blackwood had acted alone, or if others had been waiting in the mountains to help him complete whatever dark purpose had brought him to their isolated community. But the tracks would lead them to discoveries that made Blackwood's deception seem like merely the opening act in a much larger and more terrifying performance. The wagon tracks disappeared into Whistling Pine Gorge, where ancient stone formations created natural amphitheaters that trapped sound and twisted it into something resembling human voices. Sheriff Morrison's tracking party heard those phantom whispers long before they discovered what lay hidden in the mountain's deepest folds, where pine sap mixed with an acrid chemical smell that burned their nostrils and made their horses skittish. What they found would prove that Blackwood's operation extended far beyond a single traveling wagon. Morrison had assembled a search party of 6 men on October 19th, following the mysterious tracks that wound steadily upward through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous with each mile. Deputy Walsh brought his bloodhound, Rex, whose keen nose had tracked countless fugitives through these mountains over the past decade. But something about this particular scent trail disturbed the animal. Rex whined constantly and repeatedly tried to turn back, behavior completely unlike his usual eager pursuit of quarry. The tracks led them through Devil's Backbone Ridge, a narrow spine of rock that required single-file passage with 1,000-foot drops on either side. Here the wagon impressions became more erratic, as if whoever had been driving was either unfamiliar with the terrain or operating under extreme duress. Scattered along the trail, the searchers found additional evidence of hasty passage. Broken bottles that had once contained Blackwood's colorful tonics, their contents staining the rocky ground in unnatural hues. But the most disturbing discovery came 3 miles into the gorge. A crude camp had been established in a natural clearing, protected from view by towering pine trees and accessible only through a narrow gap between granite outcroppings. The site showed signs of recent occupation, but not by any ordinary travelers. Canvas shelters had been erected with military precision, and the remains of multiple campfires suggested a group far larger than Blackwood could have managed alone. From Deputy Walsh's official report, October 19, 1902, evidence of organized encampment, estimate 10 to 12 individuals based on sleeping arrangements. Purpose unknown but clearly planned operation, not random criminal activity. The equipment scattered around the campsite defied easy explanation. Medical instruments of a type none of the searchers recognized lay alongside mining tools more suited to excavation than healing. Glass apparatus, similar to what they'd found in Blackwood's wagon, had been arranged around the largest fire pit, but these devices were far more elaborate. Complex distillation equipment that could have served a chemist, or perhaps something worse. Most unsettling were the wooden crates stacked near the camp's perimeter. Each bore shipping labels from pharmaceutical companies in distant cities: Boston, Chicago, New York. But the contents had been carefully repacked into smaller containers that bore no identification. When Morrison pried open one of the crates, he found row after row of glass vials containing a thick, dark substance that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The substance moved when the container was tilted, flowing like liquid mercury but leaving no residue on the glass walls. Dr. Patterson, who had accompanied the search party, examined the vials with growing alarm. "This isn't medicine," he declared after testing a small sample. "The consistency and color suggest some form of biological extract, but from what source I cannot determine. Whatever this substance is, it has no legitimate medical application." The camp's layout revealed disturbing details about its purpose. A series of wooden tables had been arranged in a rough semicircle, each bearing restraints that showed signs of recent use. Dark stains covered the wood surfaces, stains that Dr. Patterson identified as human blood based on their color and consistency. But these weren't surgical tables designed for healing. The restraints and positioning suggested something far more sinister. Rex suddenly began barking frantically at a section of disturbed earth near the camp's eastern edge. When the men investigated, they found recently filled graves, not the carefully marked resting places of the deceased, but hasty burials that spoke of concealment rather than reverence. The bodies they exhumed would answer some questions about Blackwood's true purpose, while raising others that threatened to shake the very foundations of civilized society. What the searchers discovered in those shallow graves was evidence of systematic experimentation on human subjects. Victims who bore the same tarnished silver fingernail discoloration that marked the wasting sickness in Millhaven, but in far more advanced stages. The bodies showed signs of surgical intervention, as if someone had been extracting specific organs or tissues for study. But perhaps most horrifying was the realization that several of the victims were still alive when the procedures had been performed. Dr. Patterson's examination revealed that Blackwood hadn't been working alone. The precision of the surgical work indicated multiple trained individuals, each with specific expertise in anatomy and chemistry. This wasn't the crude butchery of a mad medicine man, but the calculated methodology of organized scientific inquiry, pursued without any regard for human suffering or consent. The wasting sickness hadn't been an unfortunate outbreak that Blackwood had exploited for profit. It had been deliberately introduced to create test subjects for experiments that defied moral comprehension. As Morrison stood among the evidence of systematic horror, one question haunted him above all others. If this mountain camp represented Blackwood's base of operations, where was the man himself, and how many other communities had suffered similar fates? The answer would come from an unexpected source, a survivor they discovered hidden in the forest, who had witnessed the true scope of Blackwood's operation and could reveal the terrifying purpose behind his traveling medicine show. A figure emerged from the tree line like a specter given flesh, her torn clothing hanging in tatters while dried blood caked her bare feet where mountain stones had carved their passage. The woman's eyes held the hollow stare of someone who had witnessed horrors that rational minds refused to process, and when she spoke, her voice carried the fractured cadence of shattered sanity struggling to reassemble itself. Her testimony would reveal that Blackwood's experiments represented only the beginning of something far more ambitious and infinitely more terrifying. The survivor identified herself as Mary Kelligan, a traveling seamstress who had encountered Blackwood's operation 3 weeks earlier in the isolated settlement of Cedar Falls, 2 valleys north of Millhaven. Her account, delivered in halting whispers beside the searchers' campfire, painted a picture of systematic horror that stretched across multiple communities throughout the Appalachian region. According to Kelligan, Blackwood had perfected his traveling medicine show over the course of several years, moving through remote mountain towns where communication with the outside world remained limited and suspicious disappearances could be attributed to the harsh realities of frontier life. Each performance followed an identical pattern: the dramatic arrival, the miraculous demonstrations, the eager customers purchasing bottles of colorful tonics. But the medicine had never been intended to heal. He called it the conditioning phase, Kelligan whispered, her fingers unconsciously tracing the rope burns around her wrists. Said the tonics prepared the subjects for optimal extraction, made the blood carry what he needed, concentrated it in specific organs. The tonics contained compounds designed to accumulate in human tissue over time, creating biological conditions that served Blackwood's true purpose. The wasting sickness wasn't a side effect of his treatments. It was the intended result, a carefully orchestrated process that transformed healthy individuals into living laboratories for his experiments. From Mary Kelligan's sworn statement, October 20th, 1902, the bottles contained different preparations for different subjects. Children received the blue liquid, adults the red. Pregnant women got something special, a green mixture that made their babies grow strange in the womb. Kelligan's escape had come during the chaos of the operation's relocation to the mountain camp the searchers had discovered. She described being held with 17 other captives in wooden cages that had been concealed beneath canvas tarps during transport. The prisoners represented harvest from 3 different communities: Cedar Falls, Millhaven, and a small mining camp called Prosperity Gulch that Kelligan claimed had been completely emptied of its population. The systematic nature of Blackwood's operation became clear through her description of the camp's hierarchy. Blackwood served as the operation's scientific director, but he commanded a team of associates with specialized roles. A man called the surgeon performed the extractions with mechanical precision, while the chemist processed the harvested materials using the complex distillation equipment. Most disturbing was the collector, whose job involved scouting new communities and identifying optimal subjects for future operations. These weren't random criminals driven by madness or greed. They were organized professionals pursuing a specific scientific objective with methodical efficiency. The substance the searchers had found in those dark vials represented the concentrated essence of whatever Blackwood was extracting from his victims. Kelligan described watching the processing procedures, how the team would drain specific fluids from still living subjects and then refine them through repeated distillation until only a few drops of the dark concentrate remained. "They called it the vital essence," she said, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Said it carried properties that could extend life, cure disease, maybe even prevent death itself. But the extraction process..." Her words dissolved into helpless sobbing. The mountain camp had served as both laboratory and staging area. While Blackwood and his team conducted their experiments on current captives, they also used the location to plan future operations. Kelligan had overheard discussions about target communities throughout the region, with particular emphasis on areas where recent hardships had created desperate populations willing to trust traveling medicine men. But the most chilling aspect of her testimony concerned Blackwood's ultimate destination. The experiments in the mountain camp represented field research for a larger project being conducted at what Kelligan called the facility, a permanent installation somewhere deeper in the Appalachian wilderness, where Blackwood's team could work without the limitations imposed by constant travel. The mountain camp was being abandoned because the operation was ready to move to its final phase. The vital essence was complete. According to Kelligan, Blackwood had been transporting his accumulated research and refined extracts to this mysterious facility, where they would be used for experiments that dwarfed anything conducted in the traveling camps. She spoke of plans involving hundreds of subjects, industrial-scale processing capabilities, and applications of the vital essence that went far beyond simple life extension. Sheriff Morrison pressed for more specific information about the facility's location, but Kelligan's knowledge remained frustratingly vague. She knew only that it lay somewhere in the region locals called the Deadlands, a remote area of the mountains where few travelers ventured, and those who did often failed to return. As Morrison studied his maps by firelight, trying to plot a course toward these mysterious Deadlands, one question tormented him above all others. If Blackwood had been collecting vital essence from multiple communities over several years, and if his facility was designed for experiments on an industrial scale, how many people had already disappeared into that wilderness laboratory? And what was he planning to do with the concentrated horror he had extracted from their suffering? The answer would require a journey into the darkest heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where the searchers would discover that some forms of scientific progress exact prices too terrible for civilized minds to comprehend. The forest fell silent as Morrison's tracking party crossed into territory where even the mountain wind seemed afraid to whisper, where centuries-old trees stood leafless despite the season, and the very soil beneath their feet felt spongy with decay. The air carried a metallic taste that coated their tongues like copper pennies, while an unnatural fog clung to the ground, regardless of temperature or humidity, creating a perpetual twilight that made navigation treacherous. Mary Kelligan's directions had brought them to the edge of a region that appeared on no official maps and existed in local folklore only as a place to be avoided. The Deadlands stretched across a natural basin surrounded by granite peaks that blocked both sunlight and outside communication, creating an isolated pocket of Appalachian wilderness where normal rules seemed suspended. No birds sang in these trees, no insects buzzed through the stagnant air, and the streams that should have provided fresh mountain water ran black with substances that defied identification. Morrison's party had been tracking for 2 days when they discovered the first evidence that Blackwood's operation had indeed established a permanent presence in this forsaken territory. A crude road had been carved through the forest, wide enough for heavy wagons and showing signs of regular use despite the desolate surroundings. The construction quality exceeded anything local residents could have managed. This wasn't a simple logging trail, but a carefully engineered transportation route designed to support substantial cargo movement. Along the roadside, the searchers found discarded materials that told a disturbing story of escalating operations. Empty chemical barrels bearing pharmaceutical company markings lay scattered in roadside ditches, their contents having long since seeped into the surrounding soil and killed everything for yards in all directions. Medical equipment too damaged for continued use had been abandoned where it fell. Surgical instruments, glass apparatus, and restraint devices that showed clear signs of violent struggle. From Sheriff Morrison's field notes, October 22, 1902. Road construction indicates major operation with significant funding and planning. This exceeds the capabilities of traveling criminals, suggests organized backing from sources unknown. But the most unsettling discovery came when Deputy Walsh's bloodhound suddenly collapsed without warning. Rex had been tracking scents along the road when he simply stopped moving, his body going rigid before toppling sideways. Dr. Patterson's examination revealed that the animal was still alive but completely unresponsive, as if something in the environment had overwhelmed his nervous system. The dog's eyes remained open and tracking, but he showed no response to commands or stimuli. The same substance affecting Rex was beginning to impact the human members of the search party. Morrison noticed it first as a slight disorientation, a difficulty focusing on distant objects that gradually worsened as they proceeded deeper into the deadlands. His men reported similar symptoms: mild nausea, persistent headaches, and a growing sense of unease that seemed to emanate from the landscape itself rather than their dangerous mission. Whatever Blackwood was doing in this place was poisoning the very environment. The road led them to a natural clearing where the fog lifted just enough to reveal the outline of structures that shouldn't have existed in such remote wilderness. What they saw challenged every assumption about the scale and sophistication of Blackwood's operation. A complex of wooden buildings sprawled across several acres, connected by covered walkways that protected workers from observation by anyone approaching through the forest. The architecture suggested permanence rather than the temporary installations they'd expected. This wasn't a camp that could be quickly abandoned, but a facility designed for long-term operations. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, indicating active work even during daylight hours. The acrid smell that had been growing stronger throughout their approach now reached overwhelming intensity, a chemical stench that burned their nostrils and made their eyes water. But the most disturbing aspect of the facility wasn't its size or sophistication. It was the sound. A low, rhythmic pulsing emanated from the central building, mechanical yet somehow organic, like the heartbeat of some enormous creature buried beneath the earth. The sound seemed to synchronize with their own pulses, creating a disorienting sensation that made concentration difficult and filled them with an inexplicable dread. The death factory was operating. As Morrison studied the facility through his field glasses, he realized that Mary Kelligan's description had failed to capture the true horror of what Blackwood had created. This wasn't just a laboratory for human experimentation. It was an industrial operation designed to process victims on a scale that defied imagination. The covered walkways weren't for weather protection. They were to conceal the movement of subjects between different stages of processing. The multiple buildings weren't for comfort or convenience. They represented an assembly line approach to extracting vital essence from human beings. Through the facility's windows, Morrison could see movement that suggested dozens of workers pursuing their grisly tasks with factory-like efficiency. This wasn't the work of a small team of medical criminals. It was a sophisticated enterprise that required substantial funding, detailed planning, and connections to suppliers and distributors that extended far beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The questions that had haunted Morrison throughout their pursuit suddenly took on new urgency. Who was financing an operation of this magnitude? And what did they plan to do with the vital essence being extracted from hundreds of victims? If Blackwood had been collecting subjects from multiple communities over several years, and if this facility could process them on an industrial scale, how many people had already disappeared into this mechanized horror? But as Morrison prepared to lead his men closer to the facility for a more detailed reconnaissance, he noticed something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Fresh wagon tracks leading away from the complex, heading deeper into the mountains toward a destination that promised revelations even more terrifying than what they'd already discovered. The wagon tracks led to a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside, where torchlight flickered against ancient stone walls that bore symbols predating any known civilization. The sound of chanting echoed from the depths of this geological cathedral, voices raised in harmonies that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bones of anyone who heard them, while the acrid smoke of burning substances created shifting patterns in the still air that suggested meaning beyond mere chemistry. What Morrison's party discovered in that primordial chamber would reveal the true purpose behind Blackwood's entire operation. The amphitheater had been modified with wooden platforms and metal apparatus that transformed the natural space into something resembling both temple and laboratory. Dozens of figures in dark robes moved with ritualistic precision around a central altar where glass vessels containing the concentrated vital essence had been arranged in complex geometric patterns. The mechanical pulsing they'd heard at the facility now emanated from this location, generated by some unseen mechanism buried deep within the mountain itself. But the most shocking revelation came when Morrison recognized several of the robed figures. Dr. Hamilton Pierce, the state medical examiner from Charleston, stood among the participants, despite supposedly being hundreds of miles away investigating other cases. Magistrate Cornelius Whitman, who had signed the warrants for their investigation, chanted alongside strangers whose faces bore the unmistakable marks of education and social standing. This wasn't a gathering of backwoods criminals. It was a convocation of respected professionals from across the region. The vital essence extraction had been serving a purpose far more disturbing than simple medical experimentation. From Morrison's concealed position behind fallen rocks, he watched as Blackwood himself emerged from shadows at the rear of the chamber. But the man who appeared bore little resemblance to the charismatic medicine show performer who had captivated Millhaven's residents. His face had taken on an unnaturally youthful appearance despite his estimated age, while his movements possessed a fluid grace that seemed to defy normal human limitations. The concentrated suffering of hundreds of victims had been transforming him into something beyond ordinary mortality. "The harvest is complete," Blackwood announced to the assembled gathering, his voice carrying impossible authority in the echoing chamber. 7 years of careful cultivation across 43 communities have yielded sufficient essence for the great working. The implications struck Morrison with nauseating clarity. Blackwood's traveling medicine show had been only the most visible aspect of a systematic operation that had been draining isolated Appalachian communities for years. Every mysterious disappearance, every unexplained illness, every family that had simply vanished from remote settlements had been feeding this monstrous enterprise. The robed figures began a ceremony that combined elements of scientific procedure with ritual practices borrowed from traditions that predated Christianity by millennia. Glass vessels containing the vital essence were connected by an intricate network of tubing that channeled the concentrated life force toward a massive apparatus positioned at the amphitheater's center. The device resembled a grotesque marriage of medical equipment and ancient altar, its brass fittings gleaming in the torchlight, while organic components pulsed with unnatural vitality. But the ceremony's ultimate purpose became clear when additional participants were brought forward, not victims for sacrifice, but beneficiaries of the process. Elderly men and women who had clearly been suffering from advanced age and infirmity were positioned around the central apparatus. As the vital essence flowed through the connecting tubes, their bodies began to change visibly. Wrinkled skin smoothed, gray hair darkened, and stooped postures straightened as the concentrated life force of hundreds of victims reversed the natural processes of aging and decay. The fountain of youth was real, but its price was measured in unprecedented horror. Dr. Patterson, crouched beside Morrison behind their rocky concealment, whispered a revelation that explained the operation's sophisticated organization and substantial funding. Several of the participants belonged to a secret society that had been pursuing life extension research for decades, using their positions of authority to identify suitable test communities and cover up the evidence of their experiments. The wasting sickness that had plagued multiple Appalachian settlements wasn't accidental contamination or natural disease. It was a deliberately engineered condition designed to prepare subjects for optimal vital essence extraction. The participants had been using their medical and legal authority to ensure that investigations were misdirected and evidence was suppressed. But as Morrison watched the ceremony reaching its climax, he realized that the immediate transformation of the elderly participants was only the beginning of something far more ambitious. Blackwood produced a crystal vessel containing a substance that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, a concentration of vital essence so pure that it appeared to exist in a state between liquid and energy. This represented the accumulated life force of every victim who had suffered in his facilities, refined to an potency that transcended normal biological limitations. Tonight we complete the work that began with our predecessors centuries ago, Blackwood declared, as he raised the vessel toward the chamber's apex. Tonight, we claim dominion over death itself. The final phase was beginning. Morrison faced an impossible decision as he watched the ceremony preparing to enter its most critical stage. His small party was vastly outnumbered by participants who commanded significant resources and political influence throughout the region. Any attempt at intervention would likely result in their own capture and addition to the vital essence supply. But if he allowed the ceremony to continue, whatever Blackwood was attempting to achieve with that concentrated horror would be unleashed upon a world that had no defense against such systematic evil. What would you do, knowing that retreat meant abandoning countless future victims, but advance meant certain death against opponents who had already proven their willingness to commit any atrocity in pursuit of their goals? The answer would come from an unexpected source, one of Blackwood's own victims, whose suffering had been transformed into something that even the medicine man's sophisticated science couldn't predict or control. Mary Kelligan stepped into the torchlight with skin that glowed like phosphorescent water and eyes that reflected the flames with an intensity that belonged to no living human being. The vital essence that had been extracted from her during captivity had somehow remained connected to her consciousness, creating a walking contradiction that Blackwood's science had never anticipated. a victim whose suffering had been transformed into something that could strike back at her tormentors. The entire ceremony ground to a halt as the impossible figure advanced toward the central altar with movements that defied natural law. Kelligan's apparent death 3 days earlier had been carefully staged, her body hidden in the forest, while she underwent a transformation that neither science nor mysticism could adequately explain. The vital essence extraction process, when interrupted at precisely the right moment, had left her existing in a state between life and death, conscious and mobile, but no longer bound by the physical limitations that governed ordinary mortality. She was living proof that Blackwood's understanding of the forces he was manipulating remained fatally incomplete. "You took our essence," Kelligan announced, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to emerge from the stone walls themselves rather than her throat. "But essence remembers. Essence chooses." The crystal vessel in Blackwood's hands began to vibrate with increasing intensity, the concentrated vital essence responding to Kelligan's presence in ways that violated every principle of his carefully constructed science. The substance that had been extracted from hundreds of victims was recognizing its original source and demanding reunion. Chaos erupted throughout the amphitheater as the interconnected apparatus began to malfunction catastrophically. Glass tubing shattered in cascading waves, spraying the robed participants with substances that burned through clothing and flesh with equal efficiency. The elderly recipients of the life extension process screamed as their artificially restored youth began reversing itself at an accelerated pace. Decades of natural aging compressing into moments of grotesque transformation. But the most dramatic change affected Blackwood himself. The medicine man's unnaturally preserved appearance began deteriorating as the vital essence he had consumed over years of experimentation turned against him. His face aged visibly with each passing second, skin wrinkling and hair whitening as his stolen longevity abandoned him to embrace its original owners. "This is impossible," he gasped, clutching the crystal vessel even as it began to crack in his trembling hands. "The extraction process is irreversible. The essence becomes part of the recipient." Kelligan smiled with an expression that combined infinite compassion with terrible justice. "You understand chemistry and biology, Dr. Blackwood, but you never understood what you were really extracting." From Morrison's concealed position, he watched in fascination and horror as additional figures began emerging from the forest surrounding the amphitheater. Other victims of Blackwood's experiments, all bearing the same phosphorescent glow that marked Kelligan's transformed state, stepped into the ceremonial space with the measured pace of inevitable judgment. They represented communities throughout the Appalachian region, men, women, and children who had suffered extraction procedures, but somehow retained enough vital essence to achieve this state of living death. The essence extraction hadn't destroyed their consciousness. It had liberated it from the constraints of individual mortality and connected them to something far larger and more powerful than Blackwood had ever imagined. The robed participants attempted to flee, but found their escape routes blocked by victims whose suffering had been transformed into an implacable force of retribution. Dr. Pierce, the corrupt medical examiner, collapsed as his own artificially extended life began consuming itself in the presence of those he had helped victimize. Magistrate Whitman aged 50 years in as many seconds, his body rejecting the stolen vitality that had been keeping him alive far beyond his natural span. The secret society's decades of life extension research was being undone in minutes by consequences they had never anticipated. But the most profound transformation was occurring within the crystal vessel itself. The concentrated vital essence had begun glowing with an internal light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the heartbeats of every living person in the amphitheater. As the crystal continued cracking under impossible internal pressure, Morrison realized that whatever Blackwood had refined and concentrated was about to be released in a form that could affect everyone present. The question was whether that release would bring healing or destruction to those who had been complicit in its creation. Callaghan approached Blackwood with the patient inevitability of natural law correcting an artificial distortion. "The essence wants to return home, Doctor. All of it. Every drop you've stolen, every life you've processed, every soul you've reduced to raw material for your experiments." The medicine man backed against the stone wall, still clutching the fracturing crystal vessel, as his artificially maintained youth continued deserting him. "The work must continue," he pleaded with lips that were already beginning to show the signs of advanced age. "The applications are limitless. Disease, aging, death itself, all can be conquered through proper understanding of vital essence." Understanding? Callaghan's laugh echoed through the chamber with the sound of wind through empty graves. "You never understood anything. You thought you were extracting a substance. But essence isn't a chemical compound, Dr. Blackwood." The crystal vessel finally shattered completely, releasing its contents in a brilliant explosion of light that seemed to pass through solid matter while illuminating the darkest corners of human consciousness. What happened next would be debated by the few survivors for the rest of their unnaturally shortened lives. But Morrison's own experience suggested that the released essence had somehow evaluated the moral weight of everyone present and delivered justice according to principles that transcended human law. The amphitheater fell silent, except for the sound of weeping, both from the victims finally receiving acknowledgement of their suffering, and from the perpetrators experiencing the full emotional weight of the atrocities they had committed. But as the supernatural light faded and natural darkness returned to the mountain chamber, Morrison realized that the immediate crisis had been resolved in a way that raised even more disturbing questions about the nature of human consciousness and the true cost of scientific progress pursued without moral restraint. Sheriff Morrison emerged from Deadman's Hollow 3 days later with hair turned completely white and hands that trembled whenever he tried to write his official report. The acrid smell of burnt chemicals clung to his clothing despite repeated washings, while his eyes held the hollow stare of someone who had witnessed the fundamental laws of reality bend and break under the weight of concentrated human suffering. His testimony would become the most controversial document in Creswell County's legal history, challenging everything the authorities thought they understood about the boundaries between science and the supernatural. The official investigation concluded on October 28, 1902, with findings that satisfied no one while protecting everyone from truths too dangerous for public consumption. Morrison's report described discovering an abandoned medical facility in the mountains, where criminal experiments had been conducted on kidnapped victims. But the supernatural elements of his experience were carefully omitted from the permanent record. The bodies found throughout the Deadlands told only part of the story. Dr. Pierce and Magistrate Whitman were discovered in the amphitheater, their corpses bearing signs of accelerated aging that forensic examination attributed to exposure to unknown chemical compounds. Blackwood himself was never found, though searchers located articles of his clothing and personal effects scattered around what appeared to be the site of a violent explosion. The facility had been thoroughly destroyed by fire, leaving only foundation stones and twisted metal to mark where the industrial-scale horror had operated. But the most puzzling aspect of the investigation was the complete absence of evidence regarding the victims. The graves that Morrison's party had documented were found empty, with no signs of recent disturbance to explain how the bodies had been removed. The restraint tables and processing equipment showed clear evidence of use, But no biological traces remained to confirm the scale of suffering that had occurred within those walls. It was as if the victims had simply vanished, taking their trauma with them into whatever realm the vital essence had opened. From the Charleston Medical Examiner's final report, November 3, 1902, physical evidence suggests large-scale criminal operation involving human experimentation. However, absence of victims or remains prevents determination of exact nature and scope of activities conducted. The state authorities declared the case officially closed, attributing the entire affair to a sophisticated organ harvesting ring that had been eliminated by internal conflict among its members. The remote location and lack of surviving witnesses made it easy to suppress details that might have prompted uncomfortable questions about how such an operation could have functioned for years without detection. But some secrets proved impossible to bury completely. Mary Kelligan's body was never recovered, despite extensive searches throughout the region. Local residents reported seeing a woman matching her description in various mountain communities over the following months, always appearing at moments when justice was needed, but official law enforcement was absent. These sightings continued for several years before gradually fading into local folklore. The Deadlands themselves underwent changes that defied scientific explanation. Within a year of the facility's destruction, the poisoned forest began showing signs of recovery that exceeded normal biological processes. Trees that had stood leafless and dying suddenly burst into unprecedented growth, while streams that had run black with chemical contamination cleared to reveal water of unusual purity. The soil that had been toxic to all plant life became extraordinarily fertile, supporting vegetation that grew with almost supernatural vigor. It was as if the released vital essence had somehow purified the landscape while restoring the natural balance that Blackwood's operations had disrupted. Dr. Patterson, the only medical professional to witness the amphitheater events and survive with his sanity intact, spent his remaining years researching the theoretical foundations of what he had observed. His private journals, discovered after his death in 1927, contained detailed speculation about the connection between human consciousness and biological vitality. According to Patterson's theories, Blackwood's fundamental error lay in treating vital essence as a purely physical substance, rather than recognizing its connection to the non-material aspects of human existence, what earlier generations might have called the soul. The extraction process had indeed concentrated the life force of multiple victims, but it had also preserved their consciousness and moral identity in ways that allowed them to reclaim their essence and redirect it toward justice rather than prolonging the lives of their oppressors. Morrison never spoke publicly about the supernatural aspects of his experience, but his behavior changed dramatically following the investigation. He resigned from law enforcement within 6 months and devoted the remainder of his life to documenting disappearances throughout the Appalachian region, particularly those involving traveling medicine shows and itinerant medical practitioners. His research revealed patterns suggesting that Blackwood's operation had been part of a larger network of similar enterprises stretching back decades. The secret society that had funded and protected these activities appeared to have been permanently disrupted by the events in the Deadlands. Several prominent medical and legal professionals across the region died mysteriously in the months following the facility's destruction, their deaths bearing similarities to the accelerated aging observed in the amphitheater. Others simply disappeared, leaving behind abandoned practices and unexplained transfers of wealth to charitable organizations serving victims of medical fraud. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Blackwood's operation was the change it brought to the isolated communities he had targeted. Settlements throughout the Appalachian Mountains developed new traditions of collective vigilance, with established protocols for investigating any traveling medical practitioners who appeared in their territories. The wasting sickness that had plagued multiple communities disappeared completely, never to return despite the region's continued poverty and limited access to legitimate medical care. The mountains had learned to protect themselves. Modern investigators who have studied the available records remain divided about what actually occurred in the Deadlands during those crucial October days of 1902. Skeptics point to the lack of physical evidence and the fantastic nature of survivor testimony, attributing the entire affair to mass hysteria complicated by exposure to unknown chemical compounds. But others note the precision with which the supernatural events targeted only those who had been complicit in Blackwood's crimes, while sparing innocent victims and witnesses. The truth, like the vital essence itself, appears to exist in a realm beyond the reach of conventional investigation, accessible only to those willing to accept that human consciousness might possess properties that transcend the boundaries of individual mortality. Whatever actually happened in that mountain amphitheater, the consequences continue to ripple through the region more than a century later, reminding anyone who cares to listen that some forms of justice operate according to laws that no earthly authority can fully comprehend or control. Even today, hikers in the Appalachian Mountains occasionally report finding abandoned medical equipment in remote locations, always accompanied by the faint scent of magnolia blossoms, despite the absence of any such trees in the immediate vicinity. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.